Okay, so I'm very happy to have the chance to speak with you, Paula, and to learn to get a chance to learn about your important work at the Prison Reform Trust as part of this series of interviews that we're doing in this conjuncture of global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and given your knowledge, your experience with the struggle among incarcerated people here in the UK, to get your reflections on, in particular, the situation in the prisons here in the UK in the context of the pandemic, but to put that in the context of the broader struggles of incarcerated people in this country. So,
Yeah.
so the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm Paula. I'm Paula Harriott. I'm a senior management team member at the Prison Reform Trust, which is it's an advocacy campaign pressure group in the UK, developing work around prison reform, historically around being a research think tank. It doesn't take government funding, which allows it to have a little bit more of a critical stance. A lot of organisations, NGOs that work in this space are dependent on government funding, and I think that does stymie their ability to develop a critical narrative. So I'm really glad, after working with several different other organisations, to have landed at the Prison Reform Trust in a senior strategic role, and to work in an organisation that categorically doesn't take government money. It feels like a space that you can operate a little bit better. My responsibilities are around prisoner involvement. So how do you involve the experience of people who are living in prison in the work of Prison Reform Trust, and more widely in the sector debate about criminal justice and the political debates about criminal justice and social reform? That's how I see my role. I think when they appointed me, perhaps they thought I was just going to do co-production. But I think my remit has expanded, and their understanding of what my role can offer to the development of the work of the Prison Reform Trust has also expanded and developed in my tenure of the role over the last 2.5 years. I think what I bring to the Prison Reform Trust is I'm a former prisoner, and to have a former prisoner appointed to that role with a specific remit of involving prisoners is a statement of intent from the Prison Reform Trust. So we did a lot of stuff around that initially. We went out to prisoners and consulted with prisoners about what they wanted from the Prison Reform Trust. What did they want in our 5-year plan? So rather than us designing our 5-year plan and then going back and saying, look what we're going to do for you, we went out with humility to say, what do you want us to do to help? It's not enough. I don't want to have prisoner involvement as an adjunct, as a sort of a nice thing that we do because we're kind. This is imperative. Do you know what I mean? Experience, expertise, and the ability for people who've lived any traumatizing, challenging, disenfranchised experience to lead their own solutions.
Yeah, self-determination.
Absolutely. This is this isn't a human right. Yeah. And we can't be there in these spaces, I suppose, like aping the hierarchical and patriarchal approaches that have failed to resolve the problems over centuries. So this is about a different way of working altogether. And it can be challenging, because it's hard work. It's hard work to build trust. I think the employment of former prisoners, we've now at Prison Reform Trust, since I've come, now have 40% of the team are people with the lived experience. That's a movement for change. in and of itself.
Yeah, well, very informative overview of all the work you've done. Now, in terms of, it's a very interesting moment to be having this conversation, because there are two things that are happening kind of at the global level right now, that have on that there's a lot of discussion going on. One has to do with this ongoing pandemic and the effect that this pandemic has on the prisons and what it means
Mm.
for people struggling along with incarcerated people, and those struggles, what it means for those struggles. That's the first thing that I'd like you to comment upon. But then also then related to this is the things that are going on have been triggered back in my home country, the United States, with respect to the police brutality and all of this mobilization on the streets. So maybe if you could talk about both of those things, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, that's fine. So with COVID, I mean, for viewers, just to know that prisons in this country have been on lockdown, a severe lockdown since early March, which means that most prisoners have been in their cells for 23 hours and 15 minutes a day, with potentially 45 minutes coming out of the prison. Some out of the cell. Some people on less than that. Some people on 23 hours, 45 minutes in the cell, with 15 minutes out of cell a day.
Wow.
So immensely difficult to manage. No family visits at all. So family visits were suspended in March. So prisoners' families, their children, haven't seen their loved ones in prison, let alone the men and women in prison see their families. You can imagine children of mothers in prison not being able to see their mum for months on end, how traumatic that has been and continues to be. So we have no family visits. We have men in prisons who don't have in-cell sanitation. Still in this country, we have landings where there is no in-cell sanitation. So men are using buckets in this time. They don't have running water in the cell, so they can't wash their hands after they've been to the toilet in the bucket. It's not a good place.
No.
Many prisons don't have in-cell telephony. So some prisons, modern prisons, have the phone in the cell, which means that men have been able to phone out at the very least and speak to loved ones. Some prisons don't have that. They have the cells on the landings. That's the majority, actually. So there may be only 3 phones on the landing. You might only get out for 15 minutes. Well, you've got a choice: a shower, use the toilet, get some hot water in your flask, make a phone call, pick up your food in 15 minutes. These are stark choices, aren't they?
Oh, yeah.
Very stark choices for people. So total disruption to the regime. So some of the ways you cope in prison is the normality of the regime, like knowing at 8 o'clock I get up and this is when I have breakfast and this is when I go to work. Just as lockdown out here in the community has been disruptive to normal routines, we've got the benefit of being able to go to the fridge whenever we like, or pick up the phone, have a WhatsApp call whenever we want, get on Zoom calls whenever we want. And actually the police don't come and lock you in your door at the night time, do they? The police aren't going around checking that your front door's locked from the outside. If you actually feel like you're going crazy, you can walk out the door, go to the shops. So all of these restrictions of liberty are so much more intensified in prison right now, where the normality of the prison regime that people have become accustomed to has been stripped away. And we have long-term segregation and cellular confinement, which all the evidence, the research evidence on long-term use of segregation and isolation in prisons shows us that it heightens mental health disorders, which were either pre-existing or emerge through the impact of long-term isolation. And the longitudinal effects in post-incarceration syndrome are frightening. But how people will remember this and what that will do to them post-release, I think that we should all be very worried. I mean, people in the community here in the UK, mental health charities are all coming together in with concerns about the long-term mental health impact of this period of lockdown on people in the community. I think they should be even more worried about what is happening to very vulnerable people with pre-existing mental health conditions or mental health conditions that are being instituted through this long-term segregation, which does not feel like, after 3 months now, does not feel like it's going to stop.
Yeah, so that's very interesting about the moment, the COVID moment, and how that's being experienced in the prison. Now, yeah, how about some reflections on this moment of rebellion against police brutality in the United States, and whether or not there's parallels to situations of racial and class oppression in this country, and how that might be being experienced. I don't know to what extent the people in the prisons are even able to follow this under the lockdown that they're in, but
well, that's so interesting, because we actually discussed it at our senior management team this morning. I mean, it's important in this work around prisoner insight and prisoner involvement to acknowledge that 26% of the prison population in this country are people of colour. I think that's really important, that we shouldn't forget that, and that's a disproportionate number of people in if comparatively to how the percentage to which people of colour make up the general population.
Yeah.
And that the Lammy Review in 2017 by David Lammy, who's a Labour MP, who's now the Shadow Justice Secretary, but was commissioned by David Cameron's government, the Tory government, to do a review into the experience of the criminal justice system for BAME, and that was the term he used then. I prefer to use the term people of colour, but which you know, categorically showed the disproportionate experiences of people of colour, from arrest to involvement in the courts to sentencing to remand, and he didn't really go into their experience within the prison system, but more into the entry into the criminal justice system. And our work at the Prison Reform Trust has very clearly demonstrated that people of colour are discriminated. There are discriminatory practices that go on in the prison service. You can't, the prison system is not disconnected from wider society, and the people who work in it are not disconnected from structural racism and unconscious bias. So in terms of responding to this, I think you can have a response to say, yeah, we stand in solidarity, but rhetoric is not meaningless if it is not backed up with action, thoughtfulness, education, mobilization. Yeah, these moments are moments when awareness is heightened, and in moments where awareness is heightened, this is the time for mobilization and action. And people need to reflect on what their theory of change is. How do you think change is going to occur? Are protests alone enough? I do think, it's important to show solidarity. It's important to understand this anger. It's important to acknowledge it. It's important to create the space to have those debates internally. It's important to create the space to include people of colour in organisations, not even include them, make it imperative that the organisation is representative of the people that it serves.
Yeah, very interesting. So you've mentioned the term solidarity. You know, around the university campuses, in intellectual circles, there's a lot of discussion about showing solidarity. What do you think are effective ways that those of us who are concerned about the plight of prisoners and the whole system of incarceration, ways that we can show solidarity?
Okay, so for me, it's in terms of the people incarcerated in prison, 100% do not extract information from us without a reciprocal gift of inclusivity. So for academics in the space, I'm really concerned about research practice that is extractive, that the ethics applications are all about supporting people but not acknowledging their agency. I don't like the fact that people are interviewed but then are not cited as co-authors. I don't like, you know, like, so for me it's about acknowledging people's expertise, citing it, making it visible. If you publish some research, make sure that the people that you've researched, if possible, they can be on platforms with you. They're acknowledged in the paper by name. Don't anonymize them, because that's another way of silencing us. You don't even name us. Sometimes, you know, like we're just participant A. Well, I've been in 6 research projects. My name's Paula Harriott. Using about this person-centered language is very important. Moving away from this damage-based narratives to strengths-based narratives, including people as co-authors, co-investigators, recognizing their contribution, citing it, you know, creating visibility for people with lived experience to speak for themselves. How you can show solidarity.
It's really powerful, really interesting. At the same time, so how do you obviously the struggle of people who find themselves incarcerated is so intertwined with all of the structural problems in society. How do you relate to people who argue along the lines of, in social movements and things like this, that the time has come where we need to put on the agenda of progressive organizations the idea of prison abolition, the abolition of prison? How do you relate to that kind of language, to that kind of discussion?
Do you know, that's really bizarre. I'll tell you, there's obviously there are arguments about abolition, aren't there? And the role of prisons and the role of criminal justice, right? Well, right here, right now, I think if you ask prisoners, and I go back to service again, yeah, there's something about vision, but there's also something about building collective consciousness and permission. Go speak to prisoners about abolition. Yeah, because if you, and I do, do you know what I mean? Like you do, I do speak. Prisoners would understand the different types of crimes that require people to be saved from themselves. And within the abolitionist arguments, there are people who, prisoners tell me all the time, there are certain people that need to be saved from themselves. Now, whether we keep them in prisons or in hospitals or we separate them from community for their own well-being, there's always going to be people who are going to need that. So I think that it's in some ways a diversionary conversation.
Any kind of last ideas, any ideas that you want to share about the work that you guys are doing, about this moment, about what solidarity can mean?
I think the moment now is double down on listening. We've had double lockdown. I'm calling it double down on listening. And this isn't about like sidestepping leadership, but understanding that the leadership needs to come from the community, not from its experts who are external to the community. And in the conversations, just like you and I have a conversation and we learn from each other, every listening conversation with prisoners is an opportunity for both sides to grow in understanding.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it feels really important to act and to move forward, but sometimes it feels important to sit and listen. And I feel like this is a moment to sit and listen as much as act.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I feel like I've learned a lot from this conversation.
Have you?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Did you know all of that?
I certainly didn't know it the way that you articulated it. So,
oh, okay, cool.
And I certainly didn't know about all the work that you guys are doing. I come at it with the intuition that social change has to happen in a self-determining way, that the people who are affected by different kinds of systemic injustices are the ones that have to lead that change themselves, and that if we don't try to figure out ways to facilitate that, we're only going to end up reproducing the very structures that
There you
we're
are. Well, that's exactly what I think, right?
Yeah.